One gay joke from jail. That's the reality of the era you're living in. Welcome to Victorian England, and in today's journey, you're gay. No offense, but let me guide you through what that actually meant in an era where being queer wasn't just socially awkward, it was a criminal offense punishable by hard labor and public ruin. You think coming out story was rough? Try living in a world where a flirtatious glance could land you in Pentonville prison. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite laws designed to crush them, some queer Victorians didn't just survive, they thrived. They built secret networks, created their own language, and left behind clues so bold that we're still finding them today. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history's most dangerous closet, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to be erased. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what comes next. Because we're about to explore 15 brutal reasons why being queer in Victorian England was a nightmare, and 3 incredible ways some people fought back anyway. Starting with the most terrifying reality of all, simply existing was enough to destroy your entire life. You wake up on August 14th, 1885, and you're a criminal. Not because you robbed someone or burned down a building, because Parliament just made your existence illegal with the stroke of a pen. The Criminal Law Amendment Act, Section 11. Any act of gross indecency between men gets you 2 years of hard labor. What's gross indecency? Nobody knows, the law didn't bother explaining. A handshake that lasted too long. A letter with flowery language. Looking at someone funny. Parliament basically said, "We'll know it when we see it," and called it a day. Brilliant legal work there, really. Why define crimes when you can just make everything suspicious? Here's the thing that makes this law absolutely mental. They didn't need proof. The old laws required witnesses, evidence, actual events happening. This new law just needed suspicion. Your landlady thinks you're odd? Evidence. Your neighbor saw you talking to another man? Suspicious behavior. You're 30 and unmarried? Red flag. Victorian lawmakers had cracked the code. Why bother with complicated investigations when you could just arrest people for vibes? Before 1885, prosecutors actually had to work for their convictions. They needed witnesses who saw specific acts. They needed medical examinations. They needed actual evidence of actual crimes. It was exhausting, all that proof gathering. But gross indecency changed everything. Now they could arrest you for intention, for possibility, for existing while different. The police loved this new system. Send a good-looking officer to chat up suspects in Hyde Park. If someone flirted back, arrest them for gross indecency. If they didn't flirt back, well, they were probably just being careful, still suspicious. It was like fishing, but the fish got 2 years in prison. Take Ernest Boulton and Frederick Park. These two had the nerve to attend theatre dressed as women, calling themselves Fanny and Stella. The authorities were so offended by their existence, they put them on trial for conspiracy to commit a felony. Problem was, they couldn't prove any felony had actually happened. The prosecutors must have been furious when those two walked free. All that effort to destroy people's lives, and they got away on technicalities, hence the beauty of the 1885 Act. No more technicalities required. This wasn't some rarely used law-gathering dust in legal books. Police actively hunted for violators. They knew which parks men visited, which pubs had certain conversations, which neighborhoods attracted artists and actors. They sent officers, usually young attractive ones, to blend in and wait for someone to take the bait. The system was ruthlessly efficient. No lengthy investigations, no complex evidence gathering. Just send in attractive officers, wait for human nature to happen, and make arrests. Victorian policing at its finest. Even celibacy couldn't save you. The law wasn't about what you did, it was about who you were. Being the wrong type of person was crime enough in Victorian England. You could be the most respectable citizen in London, church every Sunday, charity work, paying your taxes on time. But if someone decided you looked at them wrong, or your housekeeper noticed too many male visitors, or a business rival wanted to destroy you, suddenly you're explaining to a magistrate why you're not guilty of existing. The magistrates weren't interested in justice. They were interested in keeping society tidy, and society, according to Victorian thinking, needed certain types of people kept in line or removed entirely. Gross indecency charges were perfect because they stuck whether you were convicted or not. Even acquittal meant everyone knew what you'd been accused of. Your reputation was finished, your career was over, your family probably disowned you. The law achieved its goal without needing guilty verdicts. The Victorians had created something truly special, a legal system where being different was dangerous and being suspected was the same as being guilty. They'd criminalized entire categories of people without having to prove those people had actually done anything wrong. Parliament had basically said, "We don't like these types of people, so we're making it illegal to be them." Then they handed police a blank check to arrest anyone who seemed like they might fit the description. It was social engineering disguised as criminal law, behavior modification through legal terror. The threat of prosecution was often more effective than actual prosecution because it kept people in line through fear. So congratulations on surviving your first day as a newly minted criminal. Your natural feelings have been classified as indecent, your friendships are now evidence, and the police have permission to destroy your life for the crime of being yourself. But don't get comfortable thinking prison is the worst thing that could happen to you, because getting caught didn't just mean doing time, it meant complete social annihilation that would follow you for the rest of your life. The punishment wasn't just prison, it was ruin. You got caught. The police trap worked. Someone reported you. Or maybe you were just unlucky. The magistrate banged his gavel and sentenced you to 2 years hard labor. You're thinking, 2 years, I can handle 2 years. Wrong. Prison was just the warm-up act. Victorian prison meant breaking rocks with hammers until your hands bled, picking apart old rope fiber by fiber until your fingertips were raw, working human-powered treadmills because apparently regular punishment wasn't creative enough for the Victorians. The food was scientifically designed to keep you alive while making you miserable. Gruel for breakfast, bread and water for lunch, watery soup if you were lucky at dinner. They calculated the exact amount of nutrition needed to prevent death while guaranteeing constant hunger. Prison designers were remarkably precise about suffering. Then came the separate system. Hours of solitary confinement in cells barely big enough to lie down. Nothing but you, 4 walls, and the slow realization that your life was completely over. Some prisoners went insane. Others tried to kill themselves. A few succeeded. The authorities considered this proof the system was working. But physical punishment was nothing compared to what waited outside. While you were breaking rocks and losing your mind, Victorian newspapers were having the time of their lives with your story. No celebrity scandals back then, no reality TV drama, just good old-fashioned moral outrage. And homosexual trials were absolutely delicious copy. They printed everything. Your name, your address, your job, every dirty detail from the court proceedings. Headlines like "Unnatural Vice in Respectable Neighborhood" made sure everyone knew exactly what you'd done. Some papers included helpful illustrations for readers too stupid to understand the implications. Your employer read the morning paper like everyone else in London. Congratulations, you were now unemployable. Victorian businesses didn't have HR departments or anti-discrimination policies. They had reputations to protect, and hiring known deviants was bad for business. Family loyalty? How adorable. Victorian families cared about social standing and financial security, both of which you'd just destroyed. Your conviction didn't just shame you, it shamed everyone who shared your name. Your siblings couldn't find marriage prospects. Your parents became objects of gossip and finger-pointing. Any business your family had was suddenly viewed with suspicion. The practical response was obvious: pretend you never existed. Change the locks. Return letters unopened. If anyone asked, you died of consumption or moved to Australia. Some families literally held funeral services for their living sons, because being dead was better than being a known homosexual. Oscar Wilde learned this the hard way. Before his trials, he was London's golden boy, celebrated playwright, witty dinner guest, theatrical superstar. After conviction, his name was stripped from theatre programs, his books pulled from windows, his plays banned. But Wilde was rich and famous. His fall was spectacular because he'd had so far to drop. For ordinary men, destruction was quieter but just as complete. Meet John, a shipping clerk from the city, middle class, respectable, sent money home to Yorkshire. After conviction, he came out of prison to find his job gone, his apartment terminated, and his landlord demanding back rent while threatening police if John didn't disappear immediately. John's mother stopped answering letters. Former colleagues crossed streets to avoid him. Shopkeepers refused service. He was forced into the East End, taking whatever work he could find under fake names, constantly watching for someone who might recognize him. This was the real punishment, not prison but permanent exile from normal life. The Victorian system of destruction was brutally efficient. Prison broke your body and mind. Public shame destroyed your reputation. Social exile removed any chance of rebuilding. Family rejection eliminated your support system. Employment blacklisting guaranteed poverty. They'd created a machine for turning human beings into non-persons. But here's what made it truly evil. The punishment never ended. You served your time, but society never stopped punishing you. There was no rehabilitation, no second chances, no path back to respectability. You were marked for life, a walking example of what happened to people who stepped outside Victorian moral boundaries. Your continued suffering served as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow your path. The authorities had discovered something beautiful. Destroying one person's life completely was more effective than mild punishment for many people. Public ruin was social control through terror. Your destroyed life became a cautionary tale parents told their children, ministers preached to their congregations, and newspapers recycled whenever they needed to fill space with moral lessons. The Victorians had perfected the art of turning punishment into entertainment and entertainment into social engineering. So you survived prison. Your body healed, your mind maybe didn't, but you were alive. Now came the real challenge, surviving a society that had decided you no longer deserved to exist in it. But even permanent social death wasn't the worst part of being queer in Victorian England, because while you were learning to live as a non-person, the police were actively hunting your friends. Police would actively trap you. Picture this. You're walking through Hyde Park on a pleasant Tuesday evening. A well-dressed gentleman approaches with a friendly smile, comments on the weather, asks if you're enjoying the evening air. Seems like harmless small talk from a fellow park visitor. He's charming, good-looking, well-spoken. The conversation flows naturally. He mentions he's new to London, asks about good places for dinner, suggests perhaps you could show him around sometime. You're flattered. It's been a while since someone showed interest. You agree to meet for drinks later in the week. Suddenly, you're surrounded by police officers. Your new friend pulls out a badge. Congratulations, you just got honey-trapped by the Metropolitan Police Morality Squad. That friendly conversation was actually evidence of your criminal intent. The dinner invitation was proof of gross indecency. The fact that nothing remotely sexual happened is completely irrelevant. Intent was enough. Welcome to Victorian law enforcement, where the police didn't wait for crimes to happen, they created opportunities for them. This wasn't some rare police tactic used occasionally. This was standard operating procedure. The Metropolitan Police had dedicated officers whose entire job was pretending to be gay men looking for companionship. They called it detective work. We'd call it entrapment. The police knew exactly where to find their targets. Hyde Park after dark, certain pubs in Soho, the theatrical districts where actors and artists gathered, public toilets in busy areas, anywhere men might meet other men for reasons the authorities didn't approve of. They'd send in their most attractive officers. Young, well-dressed, charming men who could blend in perfectly with the crowd they were hunting. These officers were trained to flirt, to suggest, to encourage exactly the behavior that would get their targets arrested. The beauty of the system, from a police perspective, was its simplicity. No need for complex investigations or months of surveillance. Just send in attractive bait, wait for someone to bite, and make arrests. Victorian policing made efficient. But here's what made it truly twisted. You couldn't win. If you flirted back with the officer, you were arrested for gross indecency. If you didn't flirt back, you were obviously being careful, which made you even more suspicious. Either response could be used as evidence of criminal intent. The police had created a perfect trap. Show interest, get arrested. Don't show interest, get put under surveillance until they found something else to arrest you for. Take the case of the Cleveland Street scandal in 1889. Police raided a male brothel and arrested everyone they found, but they didn't stop there. They used the client lists to identify other men who might be potential targets. Then they sent officers to chat up these men in pubs and parks. The operation expanded like ripples in a pond. Each arrest led to more names, more surveillance, more honey traps. The police had discovered they could use one investigation to generate dozens more. Some officers became specialists in this work. They knew exactly how to dress, how to talk, how to position themselves to attract the right kind of attention. They studied their targets, like actors preparing for roles. These weren't bumbling constables stumbling into arrests. These were professional hunters who'd turned entrapment into an art form. The officers would spend hours perfecting their performances, learning the slang, the subtle signals, the places where certain conversations might naturally occur. They became experts in the very behavior they were trying to criminalize. It must have been a strange career path, spending your days pretending to be the thing society said was most disgusting and dangerous, learning to be convincing enough to fool people who were desperately looking for genuine connection. But the real cruelty was in the timing. These officers would often spend weeks building relationships with their targets. Friendly conversations, shared drinks, gradual escalation of intimacy. They'd let men believe they'd found companionship, maybe even love, before springing the trap. Imagine the psychological impact. You think you've met someone who understands you, who shares your feelings, who might offer a chance at happiness. Then you discover it was all performance, all lies, all designed to destroy your life. The police weren't just arresting people, they were weaponizing hope itself. Some men became so paranoid, they stopped socializing entirely. Better to be lonely than risk falling into a police trap. Others developed elaborate systems of verification, ways to test whether new acquaintances might be officers in disguise. But paranoia had its own dangers. Acting suspicious could itself be evidence of criminal intent. Being too careful meant you obviously had something to hide. The police had created a climate where normal human interaction became impossible. Every conversation was potentially evidence. Every new friendship was potentially a trap. Every moment of connection was potentially the beginning of your destruction. They turned the basic human need for companionship into a crime, and then used that crime to justify hunting people like animals. Victorian society had found the perfect solution to the problem of people they didn't approve of, make it impossible for those people to find each other and arrest anyone who tried. But even avoiding police traps wasn't enough to keep you safe, because in Victorian England, you didn't need to do anything criminal to be destroyed. You just needed someone to decide they didn't like you. You were constantly one rumor away from disaster. You survived the police traps. You avoided suspicious behavior. You kept your head down and lived quietly. Problem is, in Victorian England, Doing nothing wrong wasn't enough to stay safe. You just needed someone to decide they didn't like you. Gossip was a loaded weapon, and everyone had access to the trigger. Your business rival wants your clients. Easy fix. Whisper about your bachelor status, your refined tastes, your close male friendships. Soon everyone's wondering what's not quite right about you. Your landlord wants you gone, but can't legally evict you. Simple solution. Mention your suspicious visitors to the local magistrate. Talk about your unusual hours, your lack of female companionship. Suddenly you're homeless with no legal recourse. Your ex-lover gets bitter about how things ended. Revenge is just conversation away. Share a few private details with the right people, and your reputation dies forever. Victorian gossip required zero accountability. No proof needed, no witnesses required, no evidence necessary. Just whispered suggestions that spread through social networks like cholera through tenements. The observations always started innocent enough. He's never married at 35, lives alone at his age, gets frequent letters from London, talks rather intimately with that young clerk from his office. Normal facts that became sinister implications that became accepted truth that became grounds for social execution. The rumor mill was brutally efficient. One person's mild curiosity became 5 people's serious concern, became 50 people's absolute certainty. By the time gossip reached your ears, vague doubts had transformed into detailed accusations had become widely accepted facts. And you could do absolutely nothing to stop it. Deny the rumors. Proof you were worried, which meant they were probably true. Ignore them? Obviously guilty behavior from someone with secrets. Fight back? Aggressive overreaction that confirmed everyone's suspicions. The Victorians had built a social system where defending yourself was evidence of guilt. Charles Hammond ran a telegraph service and made the fatal mistake of employing good-looking young men. Neighbors started talking about unusual hours, well-dressed visitors, how fond Hammond seemed of his staff. No criminal evidence, no illegal witnesses, just gossip about a man who ran business differently than expected. The stories grew like cancer. Telegraph service became massage parlor, became male brothel, became aristocratic vice den. Hammond fled the country, not because courts convicted him, but because rumors made normal life impossible. Rumors were deadly because they mixed truth with fiction perfectly. Yes, you were unmarried. Yes, you had male friends. Yes, you preferred certain social circles. These facts became foundation stones for whatever story people wanted to build about you. The genius was blending accuracy with interpretation. Start with true observations, add suspicious meanings, sprinkle creative details, and create stories impossible to completely deny because parts were actually accurate. Living alone became living alone because no decent woman would have you, became preferring male company, became running some kind of unnatural establishment. Each step seemed logical. Each addition felt reasonable. By the end, you were guilty of things you'd never imagined, all based on the unshakable truth that you did indeed live by yourself. Your enemies didn't need direct accusations. They could ask pointed questions and let others draw conclusions. Victorian conversation was full of verbal landmines designed to explode reputations while keeping speakers' hands clean. Not making accusations, just raising concerns. Not spreading gossip, just sharing observations. False accusations carried real consequences, even when eventually disproven. Reputation damage happened the moment suspicion surfaced. Employers didn't want hassle of sorting truth from fiction. They wanted to avoid any scandal association. Social invitations vanished. Business relationships soured. Family members made excuses to avoid being seen with you. Even when everyone agreed rumors were false, social damage was permanent. People remembered scandal, not resolution. They remembered accusations, not denials. They remembered your name connected with unpleasant business, even when they couldn't recall specifics. Victorian society had perfected destroying people through suggestion and innuendo. They didn't need wrongdoing proof, when wrongdoing suspicion worked just as well for removing undesirable people from polite company. You could live perfectly respectable lives, follow every social rule, avoid every danger, and still wake up discovering someone had decided you were the wrong sort of person and taken steps to make that opinion widely known. The beautiful cruelty was how little effort it took to destroy someone completely. A few strategic conversations, some carefully placed doubts, a handful of pointed questions, and a perfectly innocent person became a social pariah overnight. Victorian character assassination was an art form, and everyone was both potential artist and potential canvas. But surviving the rumor mill wasn't your biggest worry, because Victorian authorities had discovered something even more effective than gossip for destroying lives. They'd made love letters into criminal evidence. Even private letters were a death sentence. You thought your private correspondence was private. How charmingly naive. In Victorian England, love letters weren't romantic keepsakes. They were evidence waiting to be discovered by the wrong people. Every word you wrote could be used against you in court. Every tender sentiment could be twisted into proof of criminal intent. Every expression of affection could become the rope they used to hang your reputation. The Victorians had turned intimacy into evidence. Consider what happened when police raided homes during investigations. They didn't just look for contraband or stolen goods. They searched for letters, diaries, poems, anything that might reveal the private thoughts and feelings of the residents. Your desk drawer full of correspondence from dear friends suddenly became a treasure trove of prosecutorial gold. That affectionate note, thanking you for a lovely evening, became proof of an illicit relationship. The poem someone wrote, comparing your eyes to summer skies, became evidence of unnatural attraction. Victorian prosecutors were remarkably creative at reading criminal intent into perfectly innocent language. A letter ending with "your devoted friend" clearly indicated something more than friendship. Mentioning that you missed someone's company obviously meant you were planning illegal activities together. The authorities had discovered that emotional intimacy between men was inherently suspicious. Any expression of deep feeling, any display of tender affection, any indication that you cared about another man's well-being became potential evidence of gross indecency. This wasn't paranoia, this was how the legal system actually worked. Court records from the period are full of letters being read aloud as evidence, with prosecutors explaining to juries exactly why phrases like "my dear fellow" or "yours always" proved the defendant's criminal nature. John Addington Symonds, a respected Victorian scholar and poet, spent years writing passionate letters to younger men he admired. Beautiful, eloquent expressions of aesthetic appreciation and intellectual connection. After his death, his literary executors burned most of his correspondence, not because it contained anything explicitly sexual, but because the emotional intensity alone would have destroyed his reputation. The burning of letters became a common practice among men who feared discovery. Entire relationships were erased from history because the written evidence of love was too dangerous to preserve. How many beautiful expressions of human connection went up in flames because keeping them meant risking imprisonment? But here's what made the letter hunting particularly vicious. Servants, landlords, and family members could turn informant at any moment. Your housekeeper dusting your writing desk might notice the frequency of letters from particular correspondents. Your landlord entering for repairs might glimpse opened envelopes on your table. Your own family members might read your mail when you weren't home. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist for people under suspicion. Letters were especially dangerous because Victorian men were expected to be emotionally restrained in their relationships. The slightest deviation from cold, businesslike correspondence could be interpreted as evidence of improper feeling. A normal letter between male friends was supposed to discuss business, weather, or practical matters. Anything approaching emotional content was automatically suspicious. Expressing genuine affection for another man marked you as dangerously different from social norms. This created an impossible situation. Human beings naturally form deep emotional connections. We write letters expressing love, admiration, longing, and devotion. But in Victorian England, these natural expressions of human feeling became legal evidence of criminal behavior. The prosecution of Oscar Wilde provides the perfect example of how letters could destroy lives. His correspondence with Lord Alfred Douglas was read aloud in court, with prosecutors emphasizing every endearment, every expression of love, every indication of deep emotional connection. The letters weren't evidence of illegal acts. They were evidence of illegal feelings. The crime wasn't what Wilde had done, but how he felt about doing it. Wilde's letters were actually quite beautiful, passionate, eloquent expressions of romantic love between two adults. In any other context, they would be treasured as examples of fine romantic writing. In Victorian criminal court, they became proof of moral degeneracy. The authorities had weaponized love itself. Some men developed elaborate codes for their correspondence, talking about business when they meant pleasure, discussing travel when they meant meetings, using initials, pseudonyms, or metaphors to hide the true nature of their relationships. But codes were dangerous too. If discovered, they proved you knew you were doing something wrong. The very act of concealing your feelings became evidence that those feelings were criminal. Others destroyed letters immediately after reading them, never keeping any written record of the relationships that mattered most to them, living in emotional isolation to avoid legal prosecution. Think about what this meant for human connection. The letters we write to people we love are often our most honest, vulnerable, beautiful expressions of feeling. They capture moments of joy, longing, appreciation, and devotion that make life worth living. Victorian law turned these treasured communications into evidence of criminality. They made love letters into death sentences. Men had to choose between expressing their feelings and protecting their freedom, between honoring their relationships and preserving their lives, between being honest about love and staying out of prison. Many chose silence. Better to feel everything and express nothing than to write beautiful letters that could be used to destroy them later. The Victorian legal system had achieved something truly remarkable. They'd made human emotion itself into a crime. Not just acts, not just behaviors, but feelings. The very capacity for deep same-sex affection became evidence of criminal nature. They'd created a world where love was dangerous and expressing love was suicidal. But even destroying all evidence of your feelings wasn't enough to guarantee safety, because Victorian society had decided that women loving women wasn't criminal, it was simply insane. Women had it better, but only because they were invisible. Female same-sex attraction wasn't illegal in Victorian England. Sounds like good news, right? Wrong. It wasn't illegal because Victorian society refused to believe it existed. The authorities had decided that women were naturally asexual, incapable of genuine sexual desire, and therefore incapable of sexual crimes. This wasn't progressive thinking. This was complete denial of female sexuality. Queen Victoria herself reportedly refused to believe that women could be sexually attracted to other women. When Parliament discussed criminalizing lesbian relationships alongside male ones, she allegedly insisted such behavior was impossible and didn't need addressing. How wonderfully convenient. Problem solved by simply pretending it didn't exist. But this legal invisibility came with its own special kind of hell. Since female queerness wasn't recognized as a crime, it was classified as a mental illness instead. Victorian doctors had convinced themselves that any woman showing strong emotional or physical attachment to other women was clearly suffering from hysteria, nervous disorders, or outright insanity. The cure wasn't prison, it was institutionalization. Lesbian women were locked away in asylums, subjected to treatments designed to cure their unnatural inclinations. Water treatments, isolation therapy, forced medication, and other medical tortures masquerading as treatment. At least men convicted of gross indecency eventually got out of prison. Women committed to asylums often disappeared forever. The medical establishment had created an elegant solution to the lesbian problem: declare these women mentally ill and lock them away indefinitely. No messy trials, no public scandals, no legal complications, just quiet removal from society. Consider the case of Anne Lister, a wealthy Yorkshire landowner who kept detailed diaries of her relationships with women. She lived openly with female partners, dressed in masculine clothing, and conducted herself more like a Victorian gentleman than a proper lady. Lister was lucky. Her wealth and social position protected her from institutionalization, but even she had to be constantly careful. Neighbors whispered about her strange behavior. Family members worried about her mental state. Local doctors suggested she might benefit from medical intervention. Less wealthy women weren't so fortunate. Working-class women showing signs of masculine behavior or same-sex attraction were prime candidates for asylum committal. Their families often cooperated with authorities, believing medical treatment would cure their daughters of unnatural inclinations. The treatments were horrific: forced cold baths to shock the system back to normal, isolation cells to prevent contamination from other patients, medications designed to suppress sexual feelings entirely, physical restraints to prevent self-stimulation or contact with other women. Victorian medicine had decided that female sexuality was so fragile and unnatural that any deviation from strict heterosexual norms indicated serious mental illness requiring aggressive intervention. But here's the truly twisted part. Many women were institutionalized not for actual relationships with other women, but for failing to show proper interest in men. Refusing marriage proposals, clearly mentally ill, preferring female friendships to male courtship, obviously disturbed, showing independence or masculine traits, definitely insane. Victorian society had created a system where women were punished for not being heterosexual enough, even when they weren't actually homosexual at all. The diagnostic criteria were laughably broad. Any woman who didn't conform to narrow expectations of feminine behavior could be labeled mentally ill. Strong opinions, physical activity, intellectual interests, financial independence, all potential symptoms of dangerous psychological disorders. Families used mental illness diagnoses to control rebellious daughters. Husbands used them to dispose of inconvenient wives. Doctors used them to justify profitable long-term treatments. The asylum system became a dumping ground for any woman who made men uncomfortable. Meanwhile, genuinely lesbian women learned to hide their relationships behind acceptable Victorian friendship patterns. Female friendships were expected to be emotionally intense, physically affectionate, and deeply devoted. Two women living together as spinster companions raised no eyebrows. The social camouflage was perfect. Victorian society celebrated passionate female friendships while completely ignoring their potential sexual dimensions. Women could live together, share beds, write love letters, and express deep devotion without anyone considering the possibility of romantic involvement. This invisibility was both blessing and curse. It allowed some women to live openly with their partners while maintaining social respectability, but it also meant their relationships weren't recognized, protected, or valued by society. Your life partner was legally just your roommate. Your marriage was just a friendship. Your family was just two spinsters sharing household expenses. None of your actual relationships had any legal standing or social recognition. When one partner died, the other had no inheritance rights, no legal claims to shared property, no recognition as next of kin. Families could separate couples, dispose of belongings, and erase decades of partnership without consequence. The survivors of these relationships often found themselves homeless, penniless, and completely alone. Their most important relationships legally never existed. Victorian society had found the perfect way to handle female queerness, pretend it wasn't real, while systematically destroying the women who lived it. They'd created a system where women were simultaneously invisible and completely vulnerable, too unimportant to criminalize, too dangerous to leave alone. The message was clear: women didn't have real sexual desires, so same-sex attraction must be mental illness. Since it was mental illness, it needed medical treatment. Since treatment was required, these women could be locked away indefinitely for their own good. It was social control disguised as medical care, oppression packaged as compassion, elimination presented as treatment. Victorian women had escaped criminal prosecution only to face something potentially worse: complete erasure of their identities, relationships, and fundamental humanity. But even medical persecution wasn't the final insult. Victorian society had prepared for queer people because their doctors had grand plans for curing this unnatural behavior once and for all. Medicine wanted to fix you. Victorian doctors had wonderful news. Homosexuality was a disease, which meant it could be cured. Wasn't that generous of them? The medical establishment had decided that same-sex attraction was a mental disorder caused by various factors including masturbation, moral degeneracy, physical weakness, or corrupted brain development. Since they'd identified the problem, they were eager to provide solutions. Their treatments were exactly as horrific as you'd expect from an era that thought cocaine was good medicine and washing hands was unnecessary. Let's start with the gentle approaches. Hypnotism was popular among forward-thinking physicians who believed homosexual desires could be simply talked away. Patients were put into trances and repeatedly told they found women attractive and men repulsive. When subjects woke up still gay, doctors concluded they needed stronger methods. Cold water treatments were considered scientifically advanced. Patients were subjected to ice baths, cold showers, and freezing wet sheet wraps, designed to shock their systems back to normal heterosexual function. The theory was that extreme cold would reset corrupted sexual impulses. The reality was hypothermia, pneumonia, and unchanged sexual orientation. Enforced celibacy was prescribed for men whose homosexual desires were attributed to excessive sexual appetite. Complete abstinence from all sexual activity would supposedly retrain their corrupted urges toward proper heterosexual channels. Patients were locked in isolation, monitored constantly, and prevented from any form of sexual expression or self-stimulation. The idea was to build up so much sexual pressure that they'd naturally redirect toward women. Most men just went insane from the isolation and sexual frustration. Physical exercise regimens were designed to build masculine characteristics that would override feminine homosexual tendencies. Patients were subjected to intensive athletic training, weightlifting, and outdoor activities that would supposedly strengthen their masculine nature. Because apparently being gay meant you weren't manly enough, and the solution was forced gym membership. Dietary treatments focused on foods believed to influence sexual development. Patients were fed bland, vegetarian diets designed to reduce sexual appetite, or alternatively, raw meat diets intended to increase masculine aggression. Victorian doctors were remarkably creative about connecting completely unrelated things to homosexuality. But the truly cutting-edge physicians weren't satisfied with these conservative approaches. They wanted permanent solutions. Surgical castration was considered the ultimate cure for male homosexuality. Remove the source of sexual desire entirely, and the problem disappeared forever. Some patients were told they were receiving surgery for other conditions, only to wake up permanently altered. Those lucky enough to keep their testicles might still face surgical intervention. Some doctors performed operations designed to redirect sexual sensation, create physical barriers to homosexual activity, or simply cause enough pain to discourage sexual behavior entirely. Female patients weren't spared surgical solutions either. Clitoridectomy was prescribed for women showing signs of sexual independence or masculine behavior. The theory was that removing the source of sexual pleasure would cure unnatural desires and make women properly submissive. Ovariectomy, surgical removal of ovaries, was another popular treatment. Doctors believed that female homosexuality was caused by hormonal imbalances that could be corrected by eliminating the source of female hormones entirely. These operations were performed without anesthesia, often without patient consent, and frequently resulted in death from infection or blood loss. Early electrical treatments were introduced as the latest scientific breakthrough. Patients were subjected to electrical shocks applied to genitals, supposedly to retrain sexual responses toward appropriate targets. The equipment was primitive, the procedures were excruciating, and the results were completely ineffective. But doctors persisted because they were convinced they were on the verge of a major medical breakthrough. Some physicians developed combination treatments that subjected patients to multiple interventions simultaneously. Cold water therapy combined with electrical shock while under hypnosis, followed by surgical procedures and enforced dietary restrictions. The logic was that if one treatment didn't work, surely combining several would produce better results. What actually happened was that patients died from the combined trauma of multiple brutal interventions applied by doctors who had no understanding of human psychology, sexuality, or basic medical safety. The most tragic aspect of these medical treatments was that many patients volunteered for them, men and women so desperate to escape social persecution that they willingly submitted to torture in hopes of becoming normal. They endured freezing, cutting, burning, and electrical shock because living as themselves had become unbearable. Victorian society had made being queer so dangerous that major surgery seemed like a reasonable alternative. Some patients begged doctors to try experimental treatments, offering themselves as test subjects for whatever new cure physicians wanted to attempt. They'd rather risk death from medical intervention than continue living under constant threat of legal prosecution and social exile. Victorian medicine had created a perfect system, classifying natural human variation as disease, offer brutal treatments that didn't work, and when patients didn't improve, conclude they needed even more aggressive intervention. The failure of treatments was never seen as evidence that homosexuality wasn't actually a disease. It was seen as proof that the disease was more serious than originally thought and required more extreme measures. Doctors published papers describing their innovative techniques, competed to develop new approaches, and built careers on treating patients whose only illness was living in a society that couldn't accept them. The medical establishment had turned human diversity into a lucrative pathology industry. But even medical torture wasn't the worst part of being queer in Victorian England, because the authorities had made sure that even your most basic human relationships were treated as criminal enterprises. Your closest relationships were treated like crimes. Forget holding hands in public. Forget sharing a home with someone you loved. Forget even being buried next to your life partner. In Victorian England, every expression of same-sex love was treated as evidence of criminal behavior. The simplest gestures of human affection became legal liabilities. A touch on the shoulder could be interpreted as inappropriate contact. Walking arm in arm with a friend could suggest improper intimacy. Even sustained eye contact might be seen as evidence of unnatural attraction. Victorian society had criminalized love itself. Two men sharing lodgings immediately raised suspicions. Why would respectable gentlemen live together unless they were engaged in illegal activities? Normal men got married and established proper households with wives and children. Bachelors sharing accommodations were obviously up to something sinister. Landlords were encouraged to report suspicious living arrangements to authorities. Police kept records of men who lived together without obvious economic necessity. Even splitting rent to save money became evidence of criminal conspiracy. The authorities had made basic companionship legally dangerous. Physical affection that was completely normal between men in earlier periods suddenly became evidence of gross indecency. Georgian gentlemen had routinely held hands, embraced warmly, and shared beds without anyone questioning their relationships. Victorian men faced arrest for the same behaviors. Society had decided that male friendships should be emotionally distant and physically restrained. Any deviation from cold, businesslike interaction suggested improper feeling that needed investigation. Women faced different, but equally restricting limitations. While their relationships weren't criminalized, any partnership that looked too much like marriage attracted unwanted attention from medical authorities. Two women living together as lifelong companions was acceptable as long as everyone understood they were just spinsters, sharing expenses. But if their relationship seemed too happy, too devoted, or too much like actual marriage, doctors might decide they needed treatment for mental illness. The message was clear. You could have relationships, but they couldn't look like real relationships. Letter writing between partners had to be carefully monitored. Too much affection expressed in correspondence could be used as evidence against you. Too frequent communication suggested unhealthy attachment. Even the tone of your writing could be interpreted as proof of criminal intent. Many couples developed elaborate codes for expressing love without creating evidence. Business language to discuss personal matters, family terms to describe romantic partners, literary references to communicate feelings that couldn't be stated directly. Love letters became exercises in creative writing designed to hide their actual meaning from hostile readers. Travel together was particularly dangerous. Two men checking into hotels as companions immediately attracted suspicion from staff trained to watch for immoral behavior. Hotel registers became surveillance tools used by police to track suspect relationships. Some couples were forced to maintain separate addresses, separate social circles, and separate public lives, even when they shared everything privately. They lived as strangers in public to protect their relationships from legal scrutiny. Victorian society had made love into a part-time secret activity that could only be practiced behind closed doors with extreme caution. But the cruelest restriction was what happened after death. Your life partner had no legal standing as your survivor. Families could exclude them from funerals, deny them inheritance rights, and erase their role in your life completely. Death notices described longtime partners as friends, servants, or distant relatives. Obituaries omitted the most important relationships in people's lives. Graveyards separated couples who had spent decades together. Some men left their estates to male companions through carefully worded wills that disguised the true nature of their relationships. They had to invent business partnerships, distant family connections, or charitable bequests to ensure their partners weren't left destitute. But families could contest these arrangements if they suspected the true relationship. Wills were overturned when courts decided that bequests to suspected homosexual partners were evidence of mental illness or criminal conspiracy. Even in death, love was treated as criminal behavior. The legal system had created a world where your closest relationships existed in constant danger of being exposed, prosecuted, and punished. Every expression of affection was potential evidence. Every gesture of love was a legal risk. People learned to compartmentalize their lives completely. Public selves that conformed to social expectations, private selves that experienced genuine human connection. The two could never meet safely. Some couples lived together for decades while maintaining elaborate pretenses about the nature of their relationships. Introducing partners as cousins, business associates, or household staff, creating fictional backstories that explained their living arrangements to curious neighbors. Others maintained separate residences and met secretly, treating their most important relationships like criminal conspiracies that required constant vigilance and careful planning. The emotional toll was devastating. Imagine never being able to acknowledge the person you loved most in the world, never being able to show affection publicly, never being able to introduce your partner as your partner. Victorian society had forced people to choose between having relationships and having safety, between expressing love and avoiding persecution, between being honest about their feelings and staying out of prison. Most chose safety, which meant living lives of emotional isolation and constant pretense. They'd created a social system where love was dangerous, affection was suspicious, and genuine human connection was treated as criminal conspiracy. But even hiding your relationships wasn't enough to guarantee safety, because Victorian authorities had made sure that even talking about love could get you in trouble. Even the language was against you. The English language itself had been weaponized against you. Every official term for homosexual behavior was designed to shame, degrade, and criminalize. Victorian society hadn't just made your existence illegal, they'd made sure the very words used to describe you were insults. Sodomite, invert, pervert, degenerate. These weren't just casual slurs thrown around by ignorant people. These were the official legal and medical terms used in court proceedings, medical journals, and parliamentary debates. The language of law and medicine had decided that you were inherently disordered, criminal, and disgusting. Court records from the period are full of prosecutors using terms like unnatural acts, abominable crimes, and disgusting perversions to describe what we'd now call normal expressions of same-sex love. The legal system had built degradation directly into its vocabulary. Medical journals weren't any better. Doctors wrote papers about sexual inversion, moral insanity, and pathological deviation when discussing homosexual patients. Even supposedly scientific discourse treated same-sex attraction as inherently diseased and abnormal. There were no neutral words, no clinical terms, no respectful language. Every way of talking about homosexuality was designed to reinforce the idea that it was wrong, sick, and shameful. This linguistic hostility had devastating psychological effects. When every word used to describe your identity is an insult, it becomes almost impossible to think positively about yourself. The language itself taught self-hatred. But Victorian queer people weren't passive victims of linguistic oppression. They fought back by developing their own secret vocabulary that allowed them to communicate safely while avoiding official detection. Polari was probably the most sophisticated of these underground languages. Originally developed by traveling performers, sailors, and other marginalized groups, it became a vital communication tool for queer men throughout England. In Polari, Omi meant man, Polone meant woman, and trade referred to sexual partners. Cottaging meant seeking sexual encounters in public toilets. Naf meant heterosexual or straight. The vocabulary was extensive enough to conduct complex conversations that were completely incomprehensible to outsiders. Using Polari, two men could discuss their romantic lives, make plans for meetings, or warn each other about police activity, while sounding like they were having incomprehensible conversations about completely innocent topics. The beauty of Polari was its complete invisibility to authorities. Police officers listening to Polari conversations had no idea they were hearing detailed discussions of illegal activities. The language provided perfect camouflage for dangerous communications. Other coded languages developed in different social circles. Artists and writers created elaborate systems of literary references and aesthetic terminology that allowed them to identify each other and communicate safely. Mentioning certain books, paintings, or poems could signal your sexual orientation to people who understood the code while appearing completely innocent to everyone else. A casual reference to Greek poetry or Renaissance art might be a way of indicating availability and interest. Some men used flower codes borrowed from Victorian women's romantic traditions. Different flowers, colors, and arrangements could communicate complex messages about attraction, availability, and romantic interest. A particular boutonniere, or carefully chosen buttonhole flower, could advertise your orientation to those who knew how to read the signals. Others developed hand signals, posture codes, and clothing choices that functioned as identification systems. Wearing certain colors, adjusting your hat in specific ways, or positioning your walking stick could indicate membership in underground communities. These communication systems were necessarily subtle because being caught using obvious codes could be as dangerous as being caught in actual illegal activity. The very existence of secret languages proved you were part of a criminal conspiracy. But coded communication was essential for survival. How else could you identify potential partners without risking exposure? How else could you warn friends about police activity? How else could you maintain any sense of community when normal social interaction was criminalized? The development of secret languages represented remarkable creativity and resilience. Victorian queer people had been denied access to normal vocabulary, so they invented entirely new ways of communicating that allowed them to maintain relationships and build communities despite legal persecution. These languages also created powerful bonds between users. Sharing polari or other coded vocabularies meant trusting someone with information that could destroy your life if revealed to authorities. The act of teaching someone your secret language was itself an act of tremendous intimacy and faith. But coded languages also highlighted the impossible situation Victorian queer people faced. They had to translate their most basic human experiences into elaborate disguises just to talk about them safely. Love became metaphor, attraction became artistic appreciation, relationships became business partnerships. Identity became performance. Even private conversations required constant vigilance and creative interpretation. The psychological impact of living in translation was enormous. When you can't use normal language to describe your experiences, those experiences start to feel abnormal, shameful, and wrong. The constant need for linguistic camouflage reinforced social messages about the illegitimacy of same-sex love. Some people became so accustomed to coded communication that they lost the ability to speak directly about their feelings, even in safe situations. The habit of disguise became so ingrained that authenticity became impossible. Others found liberation in creating new vocabularies that celebrated rather than condemned their experiences. They developed rich, positive language for describing same-sex love that countered official terminology designed to shame and degrade. Victorian authorities had tried to control queer people through language, making sure every official word used to describe them was an insult. But the community's response, creating beautiful, complex, secret languages that allowed love to flourish despite persecution, proved that human connection couldn't be legislated out of existence. The battle over language was really a battle over the right to exist with dignity. Official vocabulary tried to make queer people ashamed of themselves. Secret languages allowed them to communicate with pride and joy despite social hostility. But even developing perfect secret languages wasn't enough to guarantee safety, because in Victorian England the greatest danger didn't come from hostile authorities, it came from other queer people who might betray you to save themselves. You couldn't trust anyone, not even other queer people. The loneliest part of being queer in Victorian England wasn't the legal persecution or social rejection. It was discovering that even other queer people might destroy you to save themselves. When being discovered meant prison, career destruction, and social exile, self-preservation became more important than solidarity. Fear turned potential allies into potential enemies. Victorian authorities understood this psychology perfectly. They deliberately created conditions where queer people would betray each other rather than face consequences together. Police offered deals to arrested men, provide names of other homosexuals and receive lighter sentences. Turn informant and avoid public disgrace. Betray your friends and keep your reputation intact. The system was brutally effective. Many men faced with these choices chose survival over loyalty. Consider what happened during police raids on known gathering places. Officers would arrest everyone present, then offer immunity to anyone willing to provide information about other homosexual activities in the area. Some men broke immediately, others held out for days or weeks before the pressure became unbearable. But eventually, many gave up names, addresses, and details about the private lives of people they'd considered friends. The Cleveland street scandal demonstrated how quickly queer communities could collapse under legal pressure. When police raided the male brothel in 1889, they didn't just arrest the immediate participants, they used client lists and employee testimony to identify dozens of other men throughout London. Each arrest led to more names. Each interrogation produced more targets. The investigation spread like infection through social networks as frightened men tried to save themselves by sacrificing others. Even longtime lovers couldn't trust each other completely. When facing prison sentences, some men blamed their partners for seducing them into criminal behavior. They claimed to be victims rather than willing participants, throwing their lovers to legal wolves in hopes of receiving mercy. The authorities encouraged this kind of betrayal by offering reduced charges to men who portrayed themselves as innocent victims corrupted by predatory older homosexuals. They created incentives for partners to destroy each other. Blackmail was another constant threat that came from within queer communities as often as from outside them. People who knew about your private life could demand money, favors, or other considerations in exchange for keeping your secrets. Some blackmailers were former lovers seeking revenge for relationships gone wrong. Others were acquaintances who'd learned compromising information and decided to profit from it. A few were professional criminals who specialized in targeting homosexual men they knew couldn't go to police for help. The threat of blackmail created an atmosphere of paranoia, where everyone was a potential enemy. That charming man who struck up a conversation at the theater might be genuinely interested in you, or he might be gathering information to use against you later. Victorian queer people developed elaborate systems for vetting new acquaintances, but these precautions weren't foolproof. Some blackmailers were patient enough to spend months building trust before revealing their true intentions. The psychological impact of living with constant betrayal was devastating. Human beings need trust to form meaningful relationships. When you can't trust anyone completely, you can't love anyone completely either. Many queer Victorians became emotionally isolated, even within their own communities. They shared physical intimacy, but withheld emotional vulnerability. They formed temporary alliances but avoided deep connections that might be used against them. Others became hypervigilant about controlling information about their lives. They compartmentalized relationships so that no single person knew enough about them to cause complete destruction. They created false identities and cover stories that protected their real lives from discovery. Some developed networks of mutually assured destruction where multiple people held compromising information about each other. The theory was that betrayal would be prevented by the guarantee of mutual ruin, but even these careful arrangements sometimes failed when fear overcame rational calculation. The authorities had achieved something remarkable. They'd created conditions where queer people policed themselves more effectively than any external force could manage. The community became its own worst enemy, because survival often required destroying others who shared your situation. This wasn't universal. Many queer Victorians remained loyal to each other despite enormous pressure to betray. They chose prison over treachery, disgrace over disloyalty, ruin over betrayal of their friends. But enough people broke under pressure that trust became a luxury few could afford. Every new friendship was a potential security risk. Every romantic relationship was a vulnerability that could be exploited. Every social gathering was an opportunity for infiltration by informants. The Victorian legal system had accomplished something truly evil. They'd made love dangerous, not just because authorities opposed it, but because the people capable of understanding it might destroy you to protect themselves. They'd created a world where your greatest safety lay in isolation from the only people who could truly understand your experience. Even within queer communities, You had to assume that someone was listening, someone was watching, someone was taking notes that might be used against you later. Paranoia became a survival skill. The loneliness was crushing. You were isolated from mainstream society because of who you were. You were isolated from your own community because trusting them completely might get you killed. Victorian authorities had perfected the art of divide and conquer. They'd made queer people so afraid of each other that building lasting communities became almost impossible. But surviving betrayal and isolation still wasn't the final insult. Victorian society had prepared for queer people because they'd made sure that even death couldn't free you from their persecution. You couldn't escape it, even in death. Death should have been the end of persecution. Finally, you might think, Victorian society would leave you alone. You'd be wrong. Even corpses weren't safe from moral judgment and social correction. Your obituary would erase the most important relationships of your life. That person you'd lived with for 20 years, shared everything with, loved more than life itself. They became your housekeeper in the death notice, your business partner, your distant cousin, your faithful servant. Newspaper editors had decided that acknowledging same-sex partnerships, even in death, would corrupt public morals, so they rewrote your life story to fit acceptable narrative patterns. The man who'd been your everything became a footnote or disappeared entirely from official records of your existence. Graveyards enforced heterosexual norms as strictly as drawing rooms did. Couples who'd spent decades together were buried in separate plots, often in different cemeteries entirely. Families made sure that even in death, you couldn't be too close to inappropriate companions. Some men tried to ensure they'd be buried next to their partners by purchasing adjoining plots in advance. But families could contest these arrangements after death, moving bodies to more respectable locations away from corrupting influences. The authorities had made sure that even cemetery records would reflect proper moral standards rather than actual human relationships. Headstones were carefully edited to remove any suggestion of improper affection. Inscription phrases like beloved companion were changed to trusted friend. References to shared homes became acknowledgements of business partnerships. Poetry about love became generic sentiment about loss. Stone carvers and cemetery administrators collaborated to ensure that no grave marker would suggest relationships that violated Victorian moral standards. Estate distribution became another battlefield where surviving partners faced systematic erasure. Even carefully written wills could be contested by families who claimed that leaving property to suspected homosexual companions proved mental illness or undue influence. Courts regularly overturned bequests to same-sex partners on grounds that no sane person would leave valuable property to mere friends rather than proper family members. The assumption was that significant bequests to other men must indicate either insanity or criminal relationships. Many men were forced to disguise their intentions through elaborate legal fictions. They'd create fake business partnerships to justify leaving property to their companions. They'd claim distant family relationships that didn't exist. They'd invent charitable purposes that concealed personal motivations. But even these careful preparations often failed when hostile families hired lawyers to investigate the true nature of relationships between deceased men and their beneficiaries. Some partners found themselves completely disinherited, despite decades of shared life and mutual support. They'd wake up after their lover's funeral to discover they had no legal claim to homes they'd lived in for years, businesses they'd helped build, or possessions they'd shared daily. Victorian law had made sure that death dissolved same-sex partnerships as completely as if they'd never existed. Medical examinations of deceased homosexual men sometimes continued the persecution posthumously. Doctors performed autopsies looking for physical evidence of sexual deviance that could be recorded in medical journals for educational purposes. These examinations weren't about determining cause of death. They were about proving theories regarding the physical signs of moral degeneracy, Medical professionals used dead bodies to advance their careers by publishing papers about the anatomical characteristics of sexual perverts. Even corpses became teaching materials in the ongoing campaign to classify homosexuality as physical disease. Family reactions to homosexual deaths often involved frantic attempts to rehabilitate reputations posthumously. They destroy personal belongings, burn letters, eliminate photographs, and spread alternative stories about their deceased relatives. Some families literally rewrote history, creating fictional heterosexual relationships and eliminating all evidence of actual same-sex partnerships. They'd claim their deceased sons had been secretly engaged to respectable women or had died tragically before marriage could occur. These revisionist campaigns sometimes succeeded so completely that historians still struggle to understand the true nature of relationships that were systematically obscured by family shame and social pressure. Memorial services became exercises in creative editing, where the most important people in the deceased's life were excluded entirely. Partners who'd nursed dying lovers through final illnesses weren't allowed to attend funerals. Friends who'd provided decades of support were banned from memorial gatherings. Families created sanitized versions of their relatives' lives that eliminated any suggestion of inappropriate relationships or criminal behavior. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of posthumous persecution was how it affected the survivors. Losing someone you love is devastating under any circumstances, but losing someone while being forced to pretend they weren't the most important person in your life compounds grief with rage and isolation. Victorian surviving partners often couldn't even mourn properly. They had no socially acceptable role in funeral proceedings, no recognized claim to comfort or support, no acknowledgement of their loss from friends and family who knew the truth but couldn't speak it publicly. They had to grieve in secret while watching other people take credit for caring about the person they'd loved most in the world. Some surviving partners left the country after their lovers died, unable to bear living in places filled with memories they couldn't openly acknowledge. Others retreated into complete social isolation, becoming recluses who avoided all contact with the world that had rejected their most important relationships. A few tried to preserve the truth by writing memoirs or creating private records that would survive even if public acknowledgement was impossible. They hoped that future generations might understand what had been systematically hidden by their own era. Victorian society had achieved something remarkable. They'd made love disappear, not just from life, but from history itself. They'd created systems that erased queer relationships so completely that many partnerships left no trace they'd ever existed. Death should have been escape from social control and moral judgment. Instead, it became the final opportunity for society to impose its values by rewriting inconvenient truths and eliminating uncomfortable realities. Even the grave couldn't protect you from Victorian moral correction. But the ultimate cruelty wasn't what society did to you after death. It was what living under constant threat did to you while you were still alive. You were always watching yourself. The worst part wasn't the laws, the police, or the social persecution. The worst part was what constant fear did to your mind. You became your own jailer, your own surveillance system, your own worst enemy. Every gesture had to be calculated. Every word had to be measured. Every expression had to be controlled. You couldn't afford spontaneous reactions, natural responses, or unguarded moments. Victorian society had turned you into a full-time performer, playing the role of someone you weren't. Walking down the street became a careful choreography of acceptable masculine behavior. Steps couldn't be too light or graceful. Posture couldn't be too refined. Clothing couldn't be too fashionable. Voice couldn't be too expressive. Mannerisms couldn't be too animated. You studied other men obsessively, memorizing the patterns of acceptable behavior and mimicking them constantly. You became an expert at performing heterosexual masculinity even when nobody was watching, because you never knew who might be watching. The mental exhaustion was overwhelming. Imagine monitoring every aspect of your behavior, every waking moment, never relaxing, never letting your guard down, never being spontaneous or natural. You developed elaborate systems of self-surveillance that would have impressed the most paranoid dictator. You second-guessed every decision, analyzed every interaction, rehearsed every conversation before it happened. Social gatherings became endurance tests, where you had to maintain perfect performance for hours at a time. One slip, one moment of natural behavior, one expression of genuine personality could expose everything you'd worked to hide. You learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, express interest in topics that bored you, and pretend enthusiasm for activities you hated. You became fluent in conversations about women, sports, business, and politics, even when these subjects held no interest for you. The performance was so constant that many men lost track of who they actually were underneath the act. They'd been pretending to be someone else for so long that their authentic selves disappeared entirely. Some developed what we'd now recognize as dissociative disorders. They'd split into public and private personalities that were so different they barely seemed like the same person. The public self was carefully constructed to pass social inspection. The private self was hidden so deeply that even they sometimes forgot it existed. Others became hypervigilant about potential threats. They developed paranoid habits of checking who was listening, scanning rooms for hostile faces, interpreting innocent comments as dangerous accusations. The constant stress manifested in physical symptoms: insomnia from never feeling safe enough to sleep deeply, digestive problems from chronic anxiety, headaches from constantly monitoring your behavior, muscle tension from never relaxing completely. Victorian queer men became experts at reading social situations for signs of danger. They could detect subtle shifts in tone that indicated suspicion. They noticed when conversations stopped too abruptly or when glances lasted too long. But this hypervigilance came at enormous psychological cost. When you're constantly watching for threats, you can't enjoy safety even when it exists. When you're always analyzing other people's reactions, you can't form genuine connections with anyone. The self-monitoring became so automatic that it continued even in supposedly safe situations. Men who'd spent years hiding their true selves couldn't turn off the performance even when alone with trusted partners. Some forgot how to express genuine emotion. They'd been controlling their reactions for so long that spontaneous feeling became impossible. They'd learned to fake appropriate responses so thoroughly that authentic responses disappeared. Mirrors became enemies. Looking at yourself meant seeing all the ways you might be betraying your secret. You analyzed your own reflection for signs of difference that others might notice. Your walk, your posture, your facial expressions, your choice of clothing, everything became evidence that required careful management. You couldn't afford to look too different from other men, but you also couldn't afford to look like you were trying too hard to fit in. The psychological prison was more effective than any physical jail. You carried your persecution with you everywhere because you'd internalized the very system that oppressed you. Victorian society had achieved something remarkable. They'd made queer people police themselves more effectively than any external authority could manage. You became complicit in your own oppression because survival required it. The constant self-surveillance created a feedback loop of shame and fear. The more you monitored yourself for signs of difference, the more different you felt. The more different you felt, the more you believed you needed to hide. Some men developed elaborate personal rules about acceptable behavior. They couldn't look at other men for more than a few seconds. They couldn't touch anyone unless absolutely necessary. They couldn't express strong emotions about anything. These self-imposed restrictions often went far beyond what society actually required, but fear had made them so careful that they eliminated any behavior that might possibly be interpreted as suspicious. The isolation was crushing. You were surrounded by people but couldn't form genuine connections with any of them. You were performing constantly but never felt truly seen or understood by anyone. Even sleep wasn't safe. Dreams might betray your true thoughts. Sleep talking might reveal dangerous secrets. Some men trained themselves to wake up if they started having inappropriate dreams, turning their subconscious minds into additional surveillance targets. The system had created human beings who couldn't trust their own thoughts, feelings, or instincts. You'd become alienated from yourself as much as from other people. Victorian society had won the ultimate victory. They'd made you complicit in your own destruction. You didn't need external enemies when you'd been turned into your own worst adversary. But even this level of self-control and performance wasn't enough to guarantee survival, because despite all the dangers, despite all the persecution, despite all the reasons why being queer in Victorian England was a nightmare, some people still managed to find ways to live, love, and even thrive. They built secret lives, with codes and cover stories. After 12 chapters of unrelenting horror, you might think being queer in Victorian England was completely hopeless. It wasn't, despite laws designed to crush them, despite police hunting them, despite society treating them like diseased criminals. Some queer Victorians didn't just survive, they built extraordinary lives. They couldn't live openly, so they lived cleverly. The most successful strategy was the marriage of convenience. Two people who needed social cover would enter into platonic marriages that protected both partners while allowing them to pursue their actual relationships privately. These arrangements were more common than Victorian society ever suspected. A gay man and a lesbian woman would marry publicly, maintain separate bedrooms, and use their respectable married status as camouflage for their real romantic lives. The beauty of this system was its perfect social invisibility. Married couples were above suspicion by definition. Who would question the private lives of respectable husbands and wives? Some of these marriages became genuine friendships between people who understood each other's situations perfectly. They provided emotional support, social protection, and practical assistance in maintaining their secret lives. Others were purely business arrangements, where partners helped each other access inheritance rights, social respectability, and legal protections that were only available to married people. Either way, these marriages allowed people to live relatively openly with their actual partners while maintaining the appearance of conventional respectability. Wealth provided another powerful form of protection. Rich queer Victorians could afford privacy, discretion, and the services of people who knew to keep their mouths shut. Large country estates offered perfect settings for entertaining carefully selected guests without fear of surveillance. Servants could be chosen for their discretion and loyalty. Visitors could stay for weeks without attracting the attention that shorter, more frequent visits might provoke. Wealthy men could travel extensively, which allowed them to explore queer communities in other cities where they weren't known. They could maintain apartments in London, Paris, or Rome, where they lived completely different lives from their public personas. Money also bought legal protection. Expensive lawyers could make criminal charges disappear. Well-placed bribes could prevent investigations from starting. Social connections could ensure that scandals were hushed up before they became public. The artistic community provided another refuge for people who couldn't live conventionally. Actors, writers, painters, and musicians were expected to be slightly bohemian, which gave them cover for relationships that would seem scandalous among businessmen or politicians. Artistic circles developed their own social rules that were much more tolerant of unconventional behavior. What would be criminal gross indecency in other contexts could be dismissed as artistic temperament or creative eccentricity. Many queer Victorians gravitated toward artistic careers, not just because they were naturally creative, but because the artistic world offered the only space where they could be relatively honest about themselves. The theatre was particularly welcoming to queer men. The profession attracted people who were comfortable with performance, costume, and playing roles, skills that were essential for surviving in Victorian society as a sexual minority. Some actors lived openly with male partners within theatrical communities while maintaining completely different public personas for mainstream audiences. The theatre world understood the difference between public performance and private reality. Travel became another essential survival strategy. Continental Europe was generally more tolerant of sexual diversity than England. Many queer Victorians spent months or years abroad, living openly in places like Italy, France, or Germany, where English laws didn't apply. Some established permanent second lives in foreign countries. They'd maintain respectable residences in England for family and business purposes, while spending most of their time in European cities where they could live with their partners openly. Others used extended travel as cover for relationships that would be impossible to maintain in England. Two men could travel together as companions for months at a time without arousing the suspicion that sharing lodgings in London would provoke. The development of coded communication systems allowed people to maintain relationships and build communities despite legal persecution. These weren't just the pottery slang mentioned earlier, but elaborate systems of literary references, artistic allusions, and cultural signals. Educated queer Victorians could conduct entire conversations about their romantic lives using references to Greek literature, Renaissance art, or contemporary poetry. A casual mention of Michelangelo's David or a quote from Walt Whitman could communicate complex information about availability and interest. Some developed business partnerships that provided cover for romantic relationships. Two men could live together, share finances, and travel together as business associates without arousing suspicion that the same behavior would provoke in other contexts. These partnerships often became genuine business successes, which provided additional protection from interference. Profitable enterprises were left alone by authorities who might investigate less economically productive arrangements. The most ingenious survivors created entire fictional identities for their social lives. They'd maintain respectable public personas while developing elaborate alternative characters for their private lives. Some men adopted female personas for social gatherings, creating detailed backstories and acquiring appropriate clothing and accessories. These weren't simple drag performances, but complex alternative identities that allowed them to socialize freely with other queer people. Others developed elaborate cousin stories, where long-term partners were introduced as distant relatives from other parts of the country. This explained their close relationships while providing socially acceptable reasons for living together and traveling together. Letter writing became an art form among people who needed to communicate romantic feelings without creating legal evidence. They developed sophisticated systems of poetic metaphor, business language, and family terminology that concealed passionate love letters as innocent correspondence. Some of these coded love letters are masterpieces of creative writing, beautiful, passionate expressions of deep feeling disguised as discussions of weather, business matters, or family news. Religious communities, ironically, sometimes provided refuge for people who couldn't live conventionally. Some churches and religious organizations were more focused on charitable work than moral policing, creating spaces where dedicated unmarried people could live and work together without arousing suspicion. A surprising number of queer Victorians found protection within religious institutions that officially condemned their existence, but practically offered community and purpose to people who didn't fit conventional social patterns. The key to all these survival strategies was understanding that Victorian society cared more about appearances than reality. As long as you maintained respectable surface behavior, you could often live quite freely underneath the performance. The most successful queer Victorians became experts at giving society exactly what it expected to see while creating rich, fulfilling private lives that met their actual needs. They'd learned to work within the system rather than fighting it directly. They used Victorian social conventions as camouflage rather than obstacles. They turned society's blind spots into opportunities for freedom. But individual survival strategies weren't enough for everyone. Some people needed community, support, and connection with others who shared their experiences. They found each other in the margins. Secret lives were easier to maintain when you weren't living them alone. Despite every law designed to isolate them, Despite every social pressure intended to keep them apart, queer Victorians found ways to build communities that provided support, connection, and joy. These networks weren't advertised in newspapers or listed in social directories. They existed in the spaces mainstream society overlooked or ignored. Private salons became essential gathering places for people who couldn't socialize openly elsewhere. Wealthy hosts would open their homes to carefully selected guests who could meet, talk, and form friendships without fear of exposure. These weren't wild parties or orgiastic gatherings. They were sophisticated social events where intelligent, creative people could be themselves without pretense. Conversation was witty, companionship was genuine, and relationships could develop naturally. The key was discretion and careful vetting. New attendees were introduced by trusted friends who could vouch for their character and reliability. Everyone understood that betraying the confidence of the group would destroy something precious that couldn't be replaced. Some salons focused on artistic pursuits, providing forums for queer writers, painters, and musicians to share their work and find audiences who understood their perspectives. Others emphasized intellectual discussion, creating spaces where unconventional ideas could be explored freely. Underground balls and private parties offered opportunities for more festive socializing. These events were carefully organized to avoid police attention, while providing chances for people to dress, dance, and celebrate in ways that would be impossible in mainstream society. The planning required for these gatherings was extraordinary. Hosts had to secure private venues, screen attendees, coordinate timing to avoid suspicion, and maintain elaborate cover stories in case authorities investigated. But the events themselves were magical. People who spent their daily lives performing respectability could finally relax and be authentic. Men could dance with men, women could escort women, and everyone could experience the joy of social acceptance. Some of these parties became legendary within queer communities. Stories about particularly successful events were passed down for generations, creating shared cultural memories that helped bind communities together. Certain pubs and taverns became unofficial meeting places where queer people could find each other with relative safety. These weren't exclusively homosexual establishments, but places where the management was tolerant and the regular clientele included enough queer people to create a welcoming atmosphere. The trick was learning which venues were safe and which were surveillance traps. This knowledge was passed through careful personal recommendations, never advertised publicly. Regular customers developed subtle signals for identifying each other and communicating interest without attracting unwanted attention from other patrons or potential police informants. Some establishments developed reputations for hosting private rooms where people could meet more intimately. These arrangements required trust between customers and management, since exposure could destroy everyone involved. Professional networks provided another avenue for community building. Actors, artists, writers, and other creative professionals often knew about each other's private lives and provided mutual support and protection. These professional communities could offer practical assistance like job recommendations, housing arrangements, and travel opportunities that helped members maintain their secret lives more easily. Some theatrical companies, artist collectives, and literary societies became informal support networks where queer members looked out for each other's welfare and safety. Religious and charitable organizations, despite their official moral positions, sometimes attracted people who were seeking community and purpose outside conventional family structures. Some unmarried people found acceptance in religious communities that valued their dedication to charitable work and spiritual pursuits over their failure to conform to traditional marriage patterns. These communities weren't necessarily tolerant of homosexual behavior, but they provided social acceptance for people who lived differently from mainstream expectations. Boarding houses and residential hotels became important community centers in urban areas. Proprietors who were discreet about their tenants' private lives could create environments where queer people could live near each other and form lasting friendships. Some boarding houses developed reputations within queer communities as safe places to live. Residents would recommend these establishments to friends, creating informal networks of mutual support and protection. Living in proximity allowed people to share information about safe social venues, warn each other about police activity, and provide emotional support during difficult periods. International networks connected queer Victorians with communities in other countries where laws and social attitudes were more tolerant. These connections provided escape routes for people facing legal trouble and alternative models for how queer lives could be lived. Correspondence networks allowed people in different cities to maintain friendships and share information about local conditions, social opportunities, and political developments affecting queer communities. Some people became informal travel agents, helping members of their communities plan trips to places where they could live more openly, even if only temporarily. The development of photography created new opportunities for community building and memory preservation. Private photographers, who were discreet about their clients' requests, could create portraits that captured queer relationships and social gatherings. These photographs were dangerous to possess, but precious to their subjects. They provided proof that love existed, that communities formed, and that joy was possible despite social hostility. Some photographs were carefully coded to appear innocent to casual observers, while communicating clear messages to people who understood the cultural references and visual signals. Literary and artistic communities created lasting cultural products that served as communication systems and community-building tools. Poems, novels, paintings, and plays that included coded references to queer themes helped people feel less alone. Writers like Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, and others created works that spoke directly to queer experiences while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid legal prosecution. Reading these works became a form of community participation. Understanding the coded references marked you as part of a cultural conversation that transcended individual relationships. The most remarkable aspect of these underground communities was their resilience. Despite constant threat of exposure and destruction, they persisted and even thrived in many cases. Members developed strong bonds of loyalty and mutual protection that often lasted for decades. People who met in secret Victorian gatherings maintained friendships throughout their lives, providing support through crisis and celebration through joy. These communities proved that human connection couldn't be legislated out of existence. No matter how harsh the laws or hostile the social environment, people found ways to create spaces where love and friendship could flourish. The networks they built weren't just survival mechanisms, they were creative responses to oppression that produced lasting cultural and social innovations. But creating community wasn't enough for some queer Victorians. They wanted to ensure that future generations would know they had existed and that their lives had mattered. They left behind clues, so we'd know they were here. The most defiant act of queer Victorians wasn't surviving persecution or building secret communities, it was making sure their stories would survive even when they couldn't. Despite every law designed to erase them from history, despite every social pressure intended to make them disappear, they left behind evidence. Deliberate, careful, brave evidence that they had existed, they had loved, and their lives had mattered. They knew they were living through something horrible. They also knew they were living through something historically significant, and they made conscious decisions to preserve records that would help future generations understand what had really happened. The diaries were the most direct form of historical preservation. Men and women who understood the danger of written records still chose to document their experiences, their relationships, and their feelings. These weren't casual journals. They were deliberate acts of historical witness. The writers knew they were creating evidence that could destroy them if discovered, but they also knew they were creating evidence that would survive them. Anne Lister's diaries are probably the most famous example. She wrote in detailed code about her relationships with women, her sexual experiences, and her social observations. The code was complex enough to hide her secrets from casual readers, but simple enough that future scholars could eventually decode her messages. Lister understood that she was living an extraordinary life that deserved to be remembered. Her diaries weren't just personal records, they were historical documents that would prove women like her had existed and thrived. Other diarists were less systematic, but equally determined to leave records. They wrote about parties they attended, people they loved, and experiences that couldn't be shared publicly, but deserved to be preserved privately. Some destroyed their diaries before death to protect surviving friends and family. Others made arrangements for trusted people to preserve them with instructions that they should be made available to scholars after everyone mentioned had died. The preserved letters represent another form of deliberate historical documentation. Despite knowing that correspondence could be used as legal evidence against them, many queer Victorians continued writing beautiful, passionate letters to their lovers and friends. Some letter writers used elaborate codes that would protect them during their lifetimes while ensuring their true meanings could eventually be understood. Others were remarkably direct, apparently deciding that authentic expression was worth the risk of discovery. The letters that survived are extraordinary historical documents. They capture the emotional reality of queer Victorian lives in ways that official records never could. They preserve voices that were systematically excluded from mainstream historical narratives. Oscar Wilde's letters from prison are probably the most famous examples, but thousands of other letters from less famous people provide equally valuable insights into the daily experiences of queer Victorians. Artistic works became vehicles for preserving queer history and culture. Writers, painters, and musicians created works that documented their communities and experiences while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid legal prosecution. These artistic records are remarkable for their sophistication and beauty. Rather than simply documenting oppression, they celebrate the joy, creativity, and resilience of people who lived extraordinary lives under impossible circumstances. Poems about love between men, paintings that captured intimate moments between women, and musical compositions that expressed feelings that couldn't be spoken aloud became part of a cultural legacy that has survived long after their creators died. Photographic evidence was particularly precious because it provided visual proof that queer relationships and communities had existed. Despite the enormous risk of possessing such images, many people chose to preserve photographic records of their lives and loves. Some photographs were carefully posed to appear innocent to casual observers while communicating clear messages to people who understood the cultural codes. Others were remarkably direct, apparently created by people who decided authentic documentation was worth the legal risk. These images show us faces, relationships, and social gatherings that would otherwise be completely lost to history. They prove that love existed, communities formed, and joy was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. Professional photographers, who were sympathetic to queer clients, sometimes became unofficial historians of underground communities. They preserved images of people who couldn't be photographed openly elsewhere. Court records, ironically, became another important source of historical preservation. While the legal system was designed to punish and destroy queer people, the detailed records of trials and investigations accidentally preserved enormous amounts of information about how these communities actually functioned. Trial transcripts, police reports, and legal documents contain names, addresses, relationships, and social networks that provide historians with detailed maps of Victorian queer life. The Cleveland Street scandal alone generated hundreds of pages of documentation that revealed the existence of elaborate social networks, economic relationships, and cultural practices that would otherwise be completely unknown. These legal records are often the only surviving evidence of working-class queer life, since poor people rarely left behind personal papers or artistic works. Some people made deliberate decisions to preserve evidence by hiding it in places where it would eventually be discovered by future generations. They sealed letters in walls during house renovations, buried boxes of photographs and documents, or left coded messages in published works. These hidden archives continue to surface today, providing historians with new insights into Victorian queer life. Each discovery proves that more people were consciously working to preserve their history than anyone previously realized. Building architectural details sometimes preserved coded messages about their creators' identities. Decorative elements, room arrangements, and artistic choices were used to communicate information about the builders' or inhabitants' sexual orientations to people who knew how to read the signs. Some Victorian houses contain rooms designed specifically for entertaining queer guests, with architectural features that provided privacy and security for illegal gatherings. Garden designs, interior decorations, and even furniture arrangements were sometimes used to signal the residents' membership in queer communities while maintaining plausible deniability to hostile observers. Literary works became time capsules that preserved detailed information about queer Victorian culture. Writers embedded accurate descriptions of real people, places, and events in fictional narratives that provided cover for otherwise dangerous documentation. Novels, poems, and plays from the period often contain remarkably accurate portraits of queer social life disguised as fictional entertainment. These works preserve information about slang, social customs, meeting places, and cultural practices that would otherwise be completely lost. Some writers created elaborate fictional worlds that were actually detailed maps of real queer communities, with fictional characters based on recognizable real people and fictional locations corresponding to actual meeting places. Personal objects became vehicles for historical preservation. Jewelry, clothing, books, and household items were modified or decorated with symbols that communicated their owners' identities to future observers who might understand their significance. Some people collected objects that would serve as evidence of their existence and relationships. They preserved clothing worn to important events, kept flowers from significant occasions, and maintained collections of items that told the stories of their lives. These material objects often survived when written records were destroyed, providing historians with physical evidence of relationships and experiences that were systematically excluded from official historical narratives. The most remarkable aspect of this historical preservation effort is how conscious and deliberate it was. These weren't accidental survivals of random materials. They were calculated decisions by people who understood they were living through historically significant events and wanted to ensure their experiences would be remembered. Many people explicitly stated in their private writings that they were preserving records for future generations who might live in more tolerant times. They understood themselves as historical witnesses whose testimonies would eventually matter. Some created elaborate systems for ensuring their materials would survive and be discoverable by appropriate scholars. They made arrangements with trusted friends, established private archives, and left detailed instructions for the preservation and eventual release of their historical materials. The courage required for this historical preservation work cannot be overstated. These people were already living under constant threat of legal prosecution and social destruction. Preserving evidence of their lives and relationships multiplied those dangers enormously. But they chose to take those risks because they understood that being forgotten would be the final victory for the forces that oppressed them. They refused to let their lives and loves disappear without trace. They wanted us to know they had been here. They wanted us to understand what they had endured and how they had survived. They wanted us to see that love had existed even when it was illegal, that communities had formed even when they were forbidden, and that joy had flourished even when it was criminalized. Every diary entry, every preserved letter, every coded photograph, every hidden archive was an act of defiance against a system designed to erase them from history. They succeeded. We know they were here. We understand what they experienced. We can see their courage, their creativity, their resilience, and their refusal to be disappeared. Their preservation efforts mean that Victorian queer history isn't lost. It's hidden, coded, scattered, and sometimes dangerous to research, but it exists. Their deliberate acts of historical witness ensure that their stories can be told and their lives can be honored. They faced impossible choices between safety and authenticity, between survival and self-expression, between hiding and being destroyed. Many chose survival and hiding, but they found ways to preserve the truth for future generations who might live in better times. They left us clues so we'd know they were here, and we found them.